Hello everyone. This tutorial is for exercise 10, plant survey part 1 for the Bio 105 lab. In this video I'm going to talk a little bit about plant diversity, plant structures and their functions, bryophytes, non-seed vascular plants, and gymnosperms. So what is a plant? First off, they're multicellular eukaryotes. It means that their cells have organelles and linear chromosomes. They're photosynthetic autotrophs. That means they make their own food. They use the pigments chlorophyll and some carotenoids to produce sugar using the energy from sunlight. They make their cell walls out of cellulose, and they exhibit sexual reproduction. So there's been 4 major evolutionary events that have allowed plants to adapt to life on land. Each of these 4 events gives us the 4 major groups of plants that we know today. So the first one was embryo protection, right, developing spores. Then there was vascular tissue that allows it to transport water and nutrients. Later on, seeds allowed plants to disperse their offspring away from their parent. And then later, flowers allowed for fertilization over longer distances and different ways of distributing those seeds. So a basic view of plant evolution starts out with ancestral green algae. Right? So these were still aquatic organisms. And then you have your non-vascular plants that start to colonize the land, your first vascular plants also, and then you've got your non-seeded vascular plants, and then later conifers, and very last are flowering plants. So our first innovation was embryo protection. Plants developed spores that were able to persist long enough in the terrestrial environment that they could produce new plants. The simplest of plants are the bryophytes. These are non-vascular plants. That means that they don't have any transportation system within them to transport water or nutrients. They can only be, maybe a little less than 2 inches tall because they rely on wicking to transport water and nutrients to their tissues. They produce these gametophytes. These will produce sperm and egg. The sperm needs to actually swim to the egg through a thin layer of water. So these guys are still very water dependent. They live in wet environments. The sperm and egg combine, and then they will produce these sporophytes that will release spores. Those spores are distributed, and then they become new plants. So these guys developed somewhere back in the Ordovician, before really there was even any sort of land animals at that time. So next we're going to talk about the innovation of vascular tissue. We're going to look at the seedless vascular plants, or the pteridophytes. So what this picture here is a cross-section of the vascular tissue in a fern. And so we've got our xylem and our phloem, and these are tubules that are going to transport water and nutrients up into the plant or down into the rhizome. One of the big things that allows for is a much taller plant, a much larger plant, right? They're not limited by how far water will wick up into them. Our first group of those are Polypodiophyta. That includes whisk ferns, which look very similar to the first fossil records of vascular plants. We've got horsetails, which are also called scouring rushes. They're called that because they will actually accumulate silica in their cells, and that is basically sand, or you can even think of it as biological glass. It makes them very difficult to eat by herbivores. So ferns are our most common polypodiophyta, and you will see them commonly in the woodlands in the northeastern United States. They're quite easy to find. They have large fronds that are very leaf-like, and on the undersides of those fronds you'll find sori, which are spore-forming structures, and that's where you're actually going to be producing those reproductive spores. And then last in this group is Lycophyta. These are represented now only by these club mosses. They're relatively small. There are some that get a little bit larger and are sometimes referred to as pines, but they are actually club mosses. But back in the Carboniferous period, they were basically the equivalent of trees. And that brings me to one of the other innovations that these plants had, in that they started producing something called lignin. And that lignin, along with the cellulose that they were already producing, allowed them to basically invent wood, right? To have a woody structure that would help support them, so they were able to get even larger. So all of these plants that we've talked about so far have this alternation of generations. Start with a diploid plant, meaning it's got two copies, or two copies of every gene, or its full genome. It would produce spores that are haploid, that have half of the genome, or half the number of chromosomes. Those go through, find a place to grow. They produce a haploid plant that has still half of the chromosomes. Those produce gametes, so the sperm and egg. Though that sperm, again, remember, has to swim through at least a thin film of water to make it to the egg. So these plants are all still very dependent on wet environments in order to be able to survive. Once that egg and sperm get together, you have a diploid spore that's produced. That diploid spore, once planted, will give you an adult plant. So these early vascular plants, they show up about 410 million years ago during the Devonian. That's when we were starting to see amphibians and a lot of groups of fish. So the next innovation we're going to talk about is seeds. The next group of plants we're going to talk about are the gymnosperms. Now, seed plants are now the most plentiful plants that you're going to see out there. They use air currents to carry sperm and the pollen to the egg in the seed cones. So you've got two kinds of cones. There are pollen cones that will produce pollen. That pollen will be blown by the wind and fertilize the seeds inside these seed cones. The seed is designed to protect the embryo. It allows dispersal by insects, birds, or other animals. There's no fruit surrounding that seed, therefore the name gymnosperm, because gymnos means naked and sperma means seed. Then you've got conifers. These are pretty common, like pine, spruce, balsam. They're cone-bearing. They have needle-like leaves. Basically, if you think of a Christmas tree, right, those are conifers. So our first seed plants show up about 383 to 359 million years ago. Other gymnosperms are cycads. These are they look very similar to palms, but they are palm trees, but they're not very closely related. They produce pollen on one plant and seeds on another. So you'll see one plant will only either produce seeds and be female, produce pollen and be male. They also have those naked seeds. Then you've got ginkgo biloba. So another group of plants that used to be much more common in the past and is now represented only by a single species. Used to only be found in parts of Asia, but now is much more widespread through its use as an ornamental plant. And these guys showed up mid to late Permian, between 299 and 252 million years ago. And then the last innovation was flowers, the Angiosperms. All flowering plants are in one phylum, phylum Anthophyta. They're a large and successful group. We will talk in the next video about some of their anatomy, the reproductive strategies, and why they are such a successful group of plants. So to wrap up, the plants have four major adaptations to life on land. You've got embryo protection. All right, so you've got these spores that are able to persist and grow on land. You've got vascular tissue that's able to transport water and nutrients, allow the plants to get larger. You've got seeds that give the plants a well-protected embryo capable of being dispersed over long distances. And then you've got flowers that allow plants to reproduce with each other over long distances. And we'll also see that allows them to produce fruit and seeds in different ways that allow those to be dispersed as well. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in lab.